What's up, guys? So today is the first day of the head gasket tear down. Let's take a look. The plan for today is just to see how much I can get apart. I'm going to work on this off and on throughout the day because I've got other stuff going on, but we're going to start where right up here on top, getting these fuel lines off, these injectors off, and trying to get this intake upper and lower out, and then we'll take the belt and the alternator off, and we'll just keep going from there. So I'm just going to try out this new bite mount so you can hopefully see what I see, and we'll just see how it goes. Okay, so getting started here, the first thing that I'm going to do, I like to get the fuel lines and the evap lines out of the way so that I don't have to deal with them. So I'm just unhooking this here from the throttle body. It's kind of stuck to the throttle body, so I'm just going to leave that there because it's not going to be in my way. Just going to have to unclip the purge valve from there, unplug it from the harness. Then it is free. Then all you've got is the two fuel lines to remove. These are held on with just these little plastic push together clips on the bottom. You just push both sides together and the line comes loose. This one in the back was a little bit of a pain to get to. Not bad though. Then with those disconnected and out of the way, I can actually pick this up and just move the entire assembly of all three lines over here out of my way so that I don't have to deal with them anymore. The next thing to do, if we're going to leave that there, is to take the spark plug wires off of the coil and throw them out of the way here so that they are not on top of the intake manifold anymore. With those out of the way, I'm going to concentrate on getting this fuel rail off. So I've got to unplug all the electrical connectors, and of course the map sensor here as well, just to make it easier to pull the harness out of the way. Got one broken connector there, so I'll deal with that when we go to put everything back together. With all that unhooked, we can just move the harness out of the way here. Then this rail is only held down by 4 10mm nuts, so that's what I'm removing right now. Once those are out of the way, most of the time, if you're lucky, you can just wiggle this and pull up at about the right angle and the injectors will just pop free. I have had to get a pry bar under the bottom of the injector before to get them to release, but this one actually went really easy. Then we're going to continue unplugging things on the harness here so that it's free and I can get it out of my way. This is the mass airflow sensor. This is the throttle position sensor and the idle air valve. Then we're going to unplug the EGR. We're going to disconnect the vacuum hose that runs to the HVAC inside the car. As you can see now, the harness is getting to be pretty loose. Disconnecting the coolant temperature sensor right there. Now you can move the harness quite a bit. Then we're going to go ahead and unhook the harness from the alternator as well, because we're not going to need that hooked up. I did unhook the battery. Actually, I removed the battery before starting this process. So make sure you do that. Otherwise, when you get here, you're going to have live wires. Now what I'm using is 2 wrenches, one to hold the stud, the other to break the nut loose, because in this application, the stud was trying to turn and you don't want to do that. So once you break the nut loose, it's usually pretty easy to get it off. Should not be very tight. Then what I'm going to do here is remove the nut, pull the wire off the stud, and then put the nut back on the stud. That just cuts down on the chance of me losing the nut or having a problem later on. Always good to try to put as many bolts back as you can so that you can remember where they go when you put the car back together. One electrical connector has already been unplugged, so that's done already. With all that disconnected, this harness is pretty floppy. I can move it around pretty well to get it out of my way. I did go ahead and unplug the oxygen sensor as well. And with that, I've got now plenty of room, so we'll just throw those out of the way. And now we're going to take the serpentine belt off. And just pull the tension back like that and pop the belt off. I did then get the tool stuck, which was fun, but I was able to use my extension to kind of pry it down or hold it down a little bit so that I could get the tool off. That happens sometimes with these non-ratcheting serpentine belt tools. But with that off, now I can take the belt completely off. It is not determined yet whether or not I'm going to reuse this belt, so I'm going to keep up with it for right now. Next, I'm going to pop the nut off that holds this support brace for the alternator on. Then there's another one. The way it's actually on here right now, it's below the nut that holds the ICM bracket on. So I'm just going to loosen that to get it out of the way for right now, so I can pull it off of that stud. I should mention this car has definitely been apart several times before and has some weird mismatched parts. Anyone with a keen eye may notice that this is actually an ICM bracket off an L67. So this is a supercharged version of the ICM bracket. I could not tell you why that's like that, because it shouldn't have been an option for this year, but that's the way it is. I also saw some junkyard markings, so I'm assuming there's a lot of junkyard parts on this car, and that may be why it's got the mismatched bracket. But that's okay, because it's not going to cause any issues. The next thing I'm doing is removing the 2 bolts that hold the alternator onto the bracket. This is a 98, so this has the old 97, 98 version of the alternator and alternator bracket. It's quite a bit different from the newer 3800s that have the 3-bolt alternators. So now I'm just going to take the lower bolt loose as well. And then the alternator will just, well, actually then I missed the support brace in the back, which is just a 10 millimeter. So we're going to pull that off. And with that out of the way, the alternator will come right off. I like to once again put the bolts back in, because that way when I go to put it back together, I will know what goes where. The next move that we're going to make here, I'm going to just set this bracket out of the way, is we're going to look at removing the actual intake manifold, the upper intake manifold. But first I need to take the throttle linkage off. All you need to do that is pry the little pin that holds each cable in up a little bit, and it slides right out. Then just be very careful not to break the cruise control cable, as it's pretty easy to snap the plastic if you try to pull it off the wrong way. Once those are out, we'll just pull them over here out of the way, and we should be able to start pulling intake manifold bolts. So here I'm just pulling all of the 8 millimeters all the way around the outside. There are quite a few of them. Then I'm going to go ahead and pull the vacuum for the brake booster off. I actually pulled the little bracket that it attaches to out. You just squeeze the top of that together and it pulls completely out of the manifold. And I'm going to replace that O-ring while I'm working on it anyway, so that's why I didn't bother to try to disconnect the hose from the bracket instead. Then we got a few more 8s that we got to pull here. And then that's actually a 10, not an 8, so I've got to switch sockets. And with that 110 out, I think at this point I've got all the bolts, but I'm actually wrong. As you can see, it did not come loose, and that's because There's one 8mm back on the other side that the alternator bracket makes it kind of hard to see. You can definitely get to it with the alternator bracket in, but it's just kind of hard to see. So make sure that when you're doing it, you look around really close and don't miss any bolts. And if it feels like it's stuck, recheck for bolts. Don't force it because it's plastic and it's very easy to break. But with that done, we can now pull the throttle body and the intake manifold off as one piece. Here I'm just taking a look at that. It looks like it's got a newer gasket, which also tells me that some work's been done here fairly recently, but it looks like it's in pretty good shape. Now we're just going to move all of this wiring and stuff out of the way. We're going to disconnect the heater hoses, which someone's already got aftermarket clamps on, but those are aftermarket heater hoses too. So those have actually been replaced, which is good. That's one less thing to have to deal with this time around. So I just loosen the clamps quite a bit and twist and wiggle, and that usually will get them to come loose. I just didn't quite loosen this other clamp enough. And then because I loosened that clamp so far, make sure that you push the clamp way up the hose, because if you leave it on the end and it's really loose, you're likely to knock it off and have it fall into oblivion behind the engine while you're working. So that's why I did that like that. With all of that done, the next thing that we're going to do here is remove some bracketry. This over here is a little bracket that holds some of the stuff on the back off. These are 13mm bolts. So you just take 2 of those out and the whole bracket comes right off. I'm going to put the bolts back with the bracket and set it aside. Then there's a little bracket in the front that holds the purge valve. So I'm just going to pull that off and set it out of the way too. Now we're going to pull the EGR tube off. This is a 13mm on both sides. So I'm just loosening it up right here. Basically, what you want to do, because it's kind of wedged in here, is you just want to take both sides loose before you try to take either side out. And then you can kind of pull it out all at once. But in this particular case, on the exhaust side of it, on the EGR valve side of it, I did have a little bit of rust or something that was causing the bracket there to be stuck. Here I'm just kind of messing with it, and you can see here it was a little bit stuck there and didn't really want to come off. So I had to do a little wiggling. And then once that's done, it came right out pretty easily actually. Gonna set all that together. Now we're getting close to the end. So the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to pull this thermostat housing out. I'm going to replace the thermostat anyway, so that's why I'm just going to go ahead and separate it from the intake here. And here's where I found someone had removed the thermostat. No, 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 kids. This is a bad idea. Do not run the engine with no thermostat. Replace the thermostat if it needs it, but don't just leave it out. And here I'm going to once again put the bolts back where they go. That way when I go to put it back together, I don't have to look for them. Okay, at this point I stopped to do 2 things. I put some towels in these corners to soak up the oil. That way I could get to those 2 bolts more easily, and I stopped to drain the coolant out of the radiator. We want it as drained as possible so that when we pull this lower intake, it doesn't dump a bunch of coolant into the motor. So I've done that now, so the next thing we're going to do is be pulling this lower intake. Actually, I'm sorry, we're not going to do the lower intake first. What we're going to do next, we're going to pull this alternator bracket, and then we're going to pull the lower intake. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do here is pull the stuff out of the way and get ready to pull this alternator bracket / tensioner assembly. This is held on by 3 15mm bolts usually. In my particular application here, we were actually missing a bolt, so there were only 2 holding it on, but that's what I'm removing right now. Pulling the second one right here. Then I'm looking for the third one, but as you can see, the third one was missing, was not there at all. So after pulling that, I had to take a pry bar, and you have to just sort of gently rock this back and forth and pull away so that the two elbows will come out of the block and the lower intake without damaging the elbows too much. This car does already have the aluminum elbows on it, which is nice because that will keep them from being as likely to break. Hopefully I can just replace the O-rings and we'll be good to go on that. And I like to keep the bolts and the item together. That way when I go to put it back, I know where everything is and where everything needs to go. So next we start taking these lower intake manifold bolts off. Here's the first hidden bolt that's inside the manifold. All of these are actually 3/8 bolts. You can also get them off with a 10 as long as they're not too tight or seized or anything. But they are actually 3/8 bolts. I'm just pulling these off with my cordless impact driver. It does not matter what you use to take them off, but you will want to torque them to spec and in sequence when you put them back. Coming around now to the other side. And then here are the last two bolts. And this one right here is the other hidden one that's inside the intake manifold. With that out now, I can go ahead and remove the lower intake completely, which looks like it does have newer gaskets on it. More evidence that this car has been worked on quite a bit. I think that it was just overheated is probably why we have the head gasket failure. But we'll find out more as we go deeper here. The next thing to do is to remove the upper motor mounts. That's going to be 215s for the long bolt through the top. You can either remove the dog bones all the way and leave the main motor mount in, or you can pull the whole thing together. For this, I'm choosing to remove the entire thing, including the mount attached to the radiator support, just to give myself a little extra room and keep everything out of the way. And after your 15mm bolts on the top, you're going to have 4 13mm on each side of the mount that attaches to the radiator support. Here, I'm just zipping the last 4 bolts out right here. These lower ones that are down inside will usually fall out inside of there, so you're going to need a magnet to get those out. Here I'm just using the magnet to get the bolts out of the radiator support. With those out, I will just stick these over here together so I've got everything including the bolts to put it back. And then we're going to go ahead and start removing this ICM bracket. You can leave the coils on the ICM and on the bracket. That's not going to be a problem. It should all come off pretty easily as an assembly. You've just got 3 bolts holding it on. This one had some weird 13mm nuts. I've seen some that are not that though. And in this particular case, a couple of the studs also came out, but sometimes the studs will stay. So if it looks different on your application versus what I'm doing, that's what's going on there. This is actually an L67 ICM bracket too. I have no idea why, but someone has changed it. So it does have the supercharged model's ICM bracket on it, but like I said before, there were a lot of junkyard parts in this. So I think the previous owner maybe or something has been just sort of fixing it however with junkyard parts. But that's okay because the supercharged ICM and coils will work just fine with this application, so I'm not going to change that. Now I'm going to pull the other spark plug wires off to get them out of the way. Then I'm just going to pull the bracket back and pull the wiring around it and flip it upside down so that it's easier to get to the bottom bolt where the wiring harness attaches. This is, if I remember correctly, a 7mm bolt. And just back that out with the bolt and it pulls the wiring harness off with it. And now your ICM bracket is free, so I can just pull it off and stick it over here with the other stuff. Right there, I got stung by a wasp. That was really fun. It was a very small wasp though, so it didn't hurt too bad at least. Next, pulling off the spark plug wires from the spark plugs. This is always fun on 3800s, especially when the previous owner or whoever did this tune-up apparently did not put dielectric grease on the wires because they were stuck to the plugs really badly, and I did end up having one break. So I'm gonna have to, if I don't have a spare wire, probably put some new wires on this thing also. Okay, and we're back to the car now. We've done a little bit more. Greg's here helping out. Just, it's rare for me to have help, but just so you guys do know, I do occasionally get help. Let me show you what we've done. Basically, the back manifold is completely unbolted now, and we've just pushed it back, and we've disconnected the EGR right here and just pushed it out of the way. So this back head is basically ready to go, and we're going to do the same to the front. All the wires are already off. So the next thing we're going to do is pull the other valve cover. We're going to start pulling push rods out, and then we will go ahead and start getting these heads off. So after a little more work, let me show you where we finally wound up. This is what we've got. The heads are off. I did not film the actual pulling off of the heads, but just to give you a rundown of what else we did after the last one was we left the EGR connected, disconnected it from the head here, and just left it on the manifold since we were going to leave the manifold in the car. The manifold's right here. The heads are pulled. The engine looks remarkably clean. I'm actually really surprised by how nice everything looks in here. So I think we're going to be okay with this once we get it done. Keeping everything covered up for now. But we pulled that manifold, pulled the front manifold, the valve covers, the rocker arms, and the push rods, and then just popped 8 bolts out of each side, and the heads came right off. So that's done. The next step though is to get the heads to the machine shop. So I've got them already loaded up in the car, ready to go. Then I've got some cleanup to do here, some cleanup of some of the parts, and then when I get the heads back, we'll start reassembly. So that is going to be the end of this video because I can't do anything else right now. But in the next video in this series, we will be getting the heads back from the machine shop. We'll be putting them back on the motor, and I'll show you all the reassembly, which is really the tricky part anyway, because that's where things have to be torqued and done in the right sequence and stuff like that. So we'll get to that in the next video, but for now, I am out of here. Make sure you like this video. This one took a lot of work to make. Drop me a comment, let me know what you think of this series so far, and make sure you're subscribed so you see the next one. I will see you guys in the next video. Thanks so much for watching, and peace.